She won 23 Grand Slam titles. She held the world #1 ranking for 319 weeks. She earned more prize money than any female athlete in the history of sport. She dominated tennis for over 2 decades, forcing an entire generation of opponents to redesign their games just to survive a single set against her. The world gave her every trophy, every applause, every headline reserved for the truly untouchable. And yet, behind every single one of those victories was a woman who had not slept through the night in years. A woman who trained on cracked public courts while gunshots rang out in the distance. A woman who came within hours of dying on a hospital bed, not once, but twice, and then walked back onto the court smiling like nothing had happened. A woman who screamed in pain and was told she was being aggressive, who nearly bled out after childbirth and was told she was overreacting, who carried the expectations of an entire community on her back while the system that celebrated her never once asked if she was okay. This is not a story about winning. This is a story about what winning costs. And nobody has ever paid a higher price than Serena Williams. To understand Serena Williams, you have to start in Compton, California. Not the Compton people romanticize in music or movies, but the real Compton of the 1980s, a place where children did not get to be children for very long. The streets there taught a specific kind of education, not how to dream, how to watch, how to dodge, how to stay absolutely silent when silence was the only thing keeping you safe. Serena was born into this world before she could make any choice about it. Police sirens were background noise. Helicopters overhead were routine. Violence was not a distant concept, but something that happened close enough to feel. That instability did not just shape her environment. It sank into her memory before she even had language to describe what safety meant. She was learning to be on guard before she ever learned to trust. The Williams family lived in poverty, under constant tension, with every passing day carrying a quiet but suffocating question. Would tomorrow be any better than today? In that kind of environment, children are not encouraged to be soft. Softness meant danger. Weakness meant falling behind. And falling behind meant staying in a place that offered no mercy to those who could not keep up. Tennis arrived in Serena's life not as passion, not as joy, not as discovery. It arrived as an exit. Her father, Richard Williams, saw in a tennis racket a narrow but real escape route from everything that surrounded them. And from the moment that racket appeared, Serena's life entered an orbit with no room for deviation. Every hour was accounted for. Every practice session was mandatory. Every day that passed without improvement was a day the family could not afford. Training happened on worn-down public courts where the surface was cracked and uneven, where the surroundings were never truly safe. There were days when practice was interrupted by things that would terrorize an ordinary child. But for Serena, the fear became so familiar it stopped having a name. She learned to stand on a court with complete focus not because she loved the game, but because she understood that this was the only road that led somewhere else. Discipline came before joy. Orders came before feelings. And every shot was repeated not to master technique, but to make sure her body remembered it could not stop. She did not have a prolonged childhood. The family had no room for slowness. While other children were allowed to fail, allowed to change direction, allowed to figure things out gradually, Serena was taught that every mistake carried a cost. That cost could mean going all the way back to the beginning. The fear of losing took root before talent could even fully bloom, turning into a rough and relentless drive that had nothing to do with love for the sport. She feared losing not for pride. She feared losing because failure meant that everything her family had sacrificed would become meaningless. Every practice session under the blazing California sun did not just build athletic endurance. It built her ability to endure pain in silence, to grit her teeth, to swallow tears before she ever knew what it felt like to celebrate. Compton did not encourage softness, and Serena grew up carrying the belief, deep in her bones, that to survive, she had to be stronger than necessary. Not a little stronger. Significantly, relentlessly stronger than any circumstances she might face. The world later called her the symbol of strength. But what that world never fully acknowledged was where that strength came from. It came from a place that was never kind to her. A place that never offered her a soft landing. A place that shaped her before she had any say in the matter. And even decades later, even after every championship and every record, the memory of Compton still lingered inside her like a cold, persistent reminder. She had learned to stand firm not because she had confidence, but because if she fell, there was no one positioned to catch her. Richard Williams was not a blindly authoritarian man. He was a man shaped by decades of living in a society that had shown him exactly how little mercy it extended to people who looked like him. He had watched what happened to black families who did not fight hard enough, who did not prepare aggressively enough, who allowed their children to be ordinary in a world that punished ordinary black people without apology. Richard acted out of fear and out of love, a distorted, intense, conditional love that set the rules of his household long before his daughters were old enough to question them. In Richard's thinking, if his children wanted to survive, truly survive and rise, they could not be allowed to develop like other children. And so from very early in Serena's life, everything was already scripted. Training schedules, daily routines, how to carry themselves in front of outsiders, how to respond to questions from the press, how to absorb criticism without cracking. Everything fell under the absolute authority of a father who believed iron discipline was the only thing standing between his daughters and a life they could not escape. Richard did not just teach Serena and Venus how to play tennis. He taught them how to move through a hostile world. He taught them that mistakes were not learning opportunities but threats. Failure was not a natural part of development. It was unacceptable because failure meant going backward, and going backward meant returning to Compton. In that environment, Serena learned to read her father's expressions before she learned to listen to herself. She learned to meet demands before she learned to ask questions. Personal emotions held little value in this system because what mattered above all else was results. Richard believed the outside world would not care about his children's fears, so he built a household that did not linger on them either. When Serena was tired, she was told to push harder. When she was in pain, she was reminded that others hurt more. When she was afraid, she was told that fear was a luxury she could not afford. And so the Williams family operated like a survival machine. Each member had a specific role, and Serena grew up understanding that she was an irreplaceable part of a plan that had been written before she was old enough to consent to it. She loved her father. But she also grew up in unspoken tension, the constant low-level awareness that love always came attached to performance. Falling short was not just a personal disappointment. It was a failure of the entire system. This created something remarkable and something deeply damaging at the same time. The toughness the world later celebrated in Serena was not innate. It was manufactured in a childhood environment where success was the only path that was permitted to exist. She learned to control her emotions with precision. She learned to hide exhaustion. She learned to keep moving forward even when every part of her body and mind was demanding rest. She never had the chance to learn something equally important: how to accept vulnerability as a natural and even necessary part of being human. That gap, that missing education in vulnerability, would follow her for the rest of her life. Long after the trophies, long after the records, long after the applause died down, the family created Serena Williams. But the family also planted in her an unshakable belief that she only had the right to remain in the world if she kept standing, kept winning, kept proving her worth through victories that left no room for doubt. Venus Williams was not just Serena's sister. She was Serena's first emotional anchor, the person who opened the possibility that the family's plan could actually work, the proof that the path their father had drawn was real and not just a desperate dream. When Serena was still small enough to stand on the sidelines during practice, the one who was watched, called by name, and expected from was always Venus. Venus was first. Venus was older, taller, further along, and in the eyes of the world, Venus was the early validation that the Williams family belonged on this stage. Serena grew up in absolute admiration for her sister. But she also grew up inside a painful contradiction that had no clean resolution. Every early victory that came more easily to Venus, every piece of attention that went to Venus first, created in Serena a complicated and largely unspoken emotional landscape. She did not compete with Venus to surpass her. She existed in the painful space between wanting to be like her sister and fearing that one day becoming better than her would break something sacred that neither of them could name. When Serena did begin to pull ahead, when the victories came more often, more quickly, more decisively, the relationship between the sisters entered territory no roadmap had ever prepared them for. On the court they were opponents, forced to face each other in Grand Slam finals in front of millions of people who treated these matches as entertainment, as events to be enjoyed, analyzed, and debated. But for Serena, every point played against Venus landed differently than any other point in her entire career. Every time she defeated Venus, she did not feel complete joy. She felt as though she had just taken something away from the only person who had shared every difficult moment of their childhood, who had endured every early sacrifice alongside her, who had been both competitor and protector from the very beginning. Serena could not celebrate victories over her sister the way she celebrated other wins. The loser across the net was not a stranger she could dismiss when the match was over. The loser was her sister. The Williams family had always operated under intense pressure, but placing two sisters directly against each other on the world's largest stages added a layer of psychological complexity that neither had been prepared for. The world did not see two individuals with their own complicated emotions. The world saw two symbols, two stories, two competing narratives that made for excellent television. What the cameras did not capture was what Serena carried off the court after these matches. The weight of winning against Venus never diminished with repetition. If anything, it accumulated. Serena carried a lingering guilt that had nowhere to go. She could not refuse to compete. She could not step aside. Both of their careers were built on proving that what the Williams family had done was not a temporary accident, but a lasting reality. But the cost of that proof, in Serena's case, was that she never fully escaped the shadow of her sister. Not because Venus was better, but because Venus was the one person whose loss Serena could never fully celebrate. In those years, Serena was not only fighting opponents on the court, she was fighting herself. Fighting the question of whether her success was somehow hurting the person she loved most in this world. And that question, unlike a tennis match, had no final score. It simply stayed. When Serena Williams reached her period of absolute dominance, the world watched something it had never seen before and was not fully prepared to accept. She did not just win. She overwhelmed. Her serves carried power that had no clear precedent in the women's game. Her movement was explosive. Her ability to close out points was cold and clinical, leaving opponents no reasonable path to recovery. She entered tournaments and won them with a consistency that transformed victory from an event into a baseline expectation. But from that very moment, something deeply unfair began to take shape. When male athletes displayed that same cold efficiency, that same emotional intensity, that same refusal to apologize for dominating, the word used was composed. Focused. Great. When Serena showed it, when a black woman showed it, the language shifted completely. Every expression of emotion on the court was immediately labeled aggressive. Every reaction to a bad call became evidence of poor sportsmanship. Every frown, every frustrated gesture, was amplified and replayed as proof of a character problem that her opponents somehow never seemed to have. Serena was not allowed to display anger the way her peers were, because her anger came preloaded with decades of stereotypes that the sport, and the society around it, had never truly confronted or abandoned. Her physical strength, which was the direct result of extraordinary discipline and relentless years of training, was routinely framed as something uncomfortable, something threatening, something that needed to be explained or justified. She was asked whether her body was too masculine, whether she was playing in a way that somehow violated an unspoken standard of how a woman in this sport was supposed to look and move. These were not questions designed to understand her. They were questions designed to place her in a position where she had to constantly defend her right to exist as she was. While her opponents were allowed to have personalities, to express full emotional ranges, to be complex and unpredictable and human on the court, Serena was required to restrain herself within a narrow band of acceptable behavior. Strong enough to win, but not so strong that her strength made others uncomfortable. Emotional enough to be relatable, but controlled enough that her emotions could never be used against her. It was an impossible standard, and Serena knew it, but she also knew that failing to meet it would cost her in ways that winning trophies could not compensate for. The most painful dimension of this was not the individual criticisms, which were exhausting enough. The deepest pain came from the feeling that she was never fully allowed to enjoy what she had built. When she won, the follow-up was not admiration. It was scrutiny. Had she gone too far? Had she behaved properly? Had she given her opponents enough respect, enough credit, enough space to save face? Her victories were processed by the outside world through a filter of suspicion that her opponents never had to navigate. Serena was fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Across the net was an opponent she had prepared for, studied, trained against for weeks. But behind her, always, was an entire structure of judgment that she had no way to fully prepare for, because it did not operate by any rules she had agreed to follow. Strength was the condition for survival. But strength was also the specific reason she was treated as a problem. That was not an accident. It was the design of a system that had never been built with someone like her in mind. When Serena Williams stepped onto a court, she became something the world had agreed to accept. Invincible, composed, dominant. Every serve, every movement, every expression of controlled power confirmed the image. She never trembled in front of a final set. She never apologized for winning. She carried herself in a way that left no room for doubt, and that projection was so complete, so consistent, that the world came to see it as simply who she was. But the moment she left that baseline, when the crowd noise faded and the cameras stopped tracking her every move, a completely different Serena existed. And that Serena was living with a level of sustained anxiety that the polished surface of her public image had never been allowed to reflect. She wondered constantly how much she was resented, whether each new victory was widening the distance between herself and a world that only accepted her on its own conditional terms. She understood that one unguarded emotional moment, one expression of exhaustion or frustration that could not be immediately explained away, and the entire architecture she had spent years building could be dismantled by a single headline. Every press conference was a performance. Every interview was a calculated presentation. Even ordinary moments in ordinary spaces carried the risk of misinterpretation, because Serena understood that for someone in her position, there was no such thing as a genuinely private moment. The loneliness that grew from this life was not the loneliness of physical isolation. There were always people around her. The loneliness came from the feeling that no one, not the crowds, not the press, not even most of the people close to her, ever fully saw the real person behind the invincible image. She could not naturally share her fears, because fear spoken out loud would be interpreted as weakness. And weakness was the one thing the world had consistently demonstrated it was not willing to accept from her. She was not allowed to live the way ordinary people live. Ordinary people have the right to make mistakes, the right to be tired without explanation, the right to be afraid without it being held against them. Serena never truly had any of those rights, not in public. And over years and years of maintaining that division between the person she was and the person the world demanded she perform, the two lives began to wear against each other in ways that went far deeper than any physical injury. Every night she stepped onto the court, she put on an additional layer of psychological armor. Not because she wanted to, because without it, she could not survive what waited on the other side of any unguarded moment. And every night she removed that armor behind closed doors, the exhaustion underneath it was deeper than the night before. Dominance did not bring freedom. It brought a narrower and narrower space in which to exist as a full human being. And eventually, that space became so small that even breathing inside it required careful, deliberate management. Serena's body did not break in a single dramatic moment. It was more patient than that. The damage accumulated across seasons that stretched far beyond what the human body was engineered to endure. In the tendons, the muscles, the knees, the back, the ankles, all of it bearing the marks of thousands of hours of competition on surfaces that show no mercy to the people who play on them. For years, Serena managed this pain the way she had been trained to manage everything uncomfortable, by not acknowledging it. Injuries were suppressed. Discomfort was medicated or willed past. The belief that just a little more effort would make it pass was a belief she had carried since Compton, and she applied it to her deteriorating body the same way she applied it to every other obstacle. She kept stepping onto the court with her familiar smile and her familiar confidence, and the world kept seeing a Serena who was intact because she had become extraordinarily skilled at making sure that was all anyone ever saw. Then in 2011, her body ended the negotiation. After a surgery and what was supposed to be a routine recovery period, Serena experienced a pulmonary embolism. Blood clots moved through her body without warning. Silently, each breath became labored. Each chest pain was a signal she recognized from somewhere deep in her medical history. A signal that death was not a metaphor, but a physical reality pressing close. For the first time in her life, Serena was not facing the possibility of losing a match. She was facing the possibility of not waking up tomorrow. The hospital replaced the court. Medical equipment replaced the racket. And helplessness, a sensation Serena had spent her entire life training herself to never feel, replaced the sense of control she had built her identity around. Her physical strength, the very thing that had made the world nervous in admiration, meant absolutely nothing in that room. Her body had stopped obeying the commands of her will, and there was nothing she could do to force it back into compliance. She understood in those hours that everything she had built could end not in a dramatic match, not in a televised farewell, but quietly, in a hospital bed, with no audience and no applause and no opportunity to say goodbye to any of it. The risk was real, documentable, not exaggerated for a compelling story. When Serena returned to the public eye after surviving that ordeal, the familiar smile was back in place. The world praised her resilience. The narrative of the invincible comeback was restored. But behind that smile was a new and permanent layer of fear that had not existed before, colder than anything she had previously known. Her body could betray her at any moment. Any unusual sensation could be the beginning of a new crisis. Every training session, every match, every physical demand she placed on herself carried a risk she now understood with terrifying clarity. She hid the sleepless nights, the moments of panic when her heartbeat skipped unexpectedly, the uninvited thoughts about death that had never before been part of her inner landscape. She kept training, kept competing, kept maintaining the rhythm that had always felt like control. But inside, a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. She was no longer invincible in her own mind, and that was the one place her invincibility had always lived. When Serena Williams became pregnant, she entered the experience carrying decades of evidence that she was physically capable of extraordinary things. She had survived a pulmonary embolism. She had returned from surgeries that would have ended most careers. She had competed through levels of pain that most people will never experience. Her body was not fragile. She understood her body better than almost anyone alive. And none of that knowledge, none of that track record, none of that expertise about her own physical experience protected her when she needed it most. After giving birth to her daughter, Serena felt shortness of breath. Familiar. Frightening. The sensation she associated directly with the blood clot crisis that had nearly killed her years before. She communicated this clearly. She demanded to be heard. She asked for scans. She told the medical staff exactly what she was feeling and exactly why she believed it needed to be taken seriously. She was not panicking. She was drawing on a decade of first-hand experience with her own body and providing precise information to the people who were supposed to protect her. They did not believe her. Her concerns were dismissed, categorized as anxiety, attributed to the emotional disruption of a new mother rather than to the medical history she had just explicitly described. The specific documented knowledge she brought into that room, knowledge about her own body, about her own symptoms, about her own prior life-threatening condition, was set aside. And in the window that followed, blood clots began forming, tracking exactly the pattern she had warned them about. When the truth was finally confirmed and the emergency response began, Serena's body, which had already gone through the physical trauma of childbirth, was subjected to additional surgery while in its most vulnerable state. The pain compounded. The fear compounded. She was staring at the possibility of leaving her child without a mother, not through some unpredictable catastrophe, but through a medical system that had dismissed her voice at the moment it mattered most. She survived, but the experience left something behind that went beyond physical recovery. For the first time in her life, Serena understood that even someone with her level of achievement, her level of visibility, her level of fame, could be made invisible by a single doctor who decided not to listen. She was not treated as an expert on her own body. She was not treated as a woman with a documented medical history demanding appropriate attention. She was treated as a black woman whose concerns did not need to be taken seriously. That realization shook the foundation of the belief she had spent her entire life building. The belief that her strength, her will, her track record could protect her from the worst outcomes. They could not. Not in that room. And that truth, silent and permanent, became part of her in a way that no championship win could touch. Coming back to tennis after childbirth, after surgery, after the near-death experience, before her body had genuinely recovered, was not a decision made from confidence. It was a decision made by someone who had spent her entire life being told that stopping was not an option, and who still, even after everything, did not fully know how to give herself permission to rest. Serena returned. But she returned divided in a way she had never been before. On one side was a young child at home, completely dependent, requiring a presence and a consistency that a professional tennis career operating at the highest level of the sport makes structurally impossible. On the other side was a world that had already declared her comeback a story worth following, a legacy worth protecting, a narrative that demanded she demonstrate she was still the same force the sport had always known her to be. She could not win in either direction. When she trained, she was missing moments with her daughter that could not be recovered. When she was with her daughter, the career clock was running, and the demands of keeping her body at competitive level were not pausing out of consideration for her emotional needs. No schedule existed that could honor both realities fully, and the guilt that grew out of that impossibility was constant. Society's judgment did not wait for an invitation. Serena was scrutinized for returning too soon. She was scrutinized for not being present enough as a mother. Every decision she made in either direction was evaluated by people who had never spent a single day navigating the specific intersection of her circumstances, and who nonetheless felt entitled to a verdict. Fame did not provide any buffer from this judgment. If anything, the visibility made the judgments louder, more public, and less forgiving than they would have been for anyone else. The exhaustion was not only physical. It was the exhaustion of two worlds pulling against each other with equal force, with no pause and no acknowledged middle ground. Serena kept moving. Not because she had found a solution, not because some balance had been achieved, but because she had never learned another way to exist. The world praised her will. Rarely did anyone ask what she had given up to keep displaying it. For years, trophies arrived at a pace that made the outside world grow accustomed to viewing Serena's dominance as inevitable. Grand slams were won, and records were broken, and new records were set, and the numbers grew longer, and the image of Serena raising a trophy became as fixed a cultural reference point as any American sports icon of her generation. But inside that accumulation of victories, something was happening that the record books could not capture. Each new title did not bring relief. It brought a new weight of expectation, heavier than the one that preceded it. Winning was no longer an achievement. It had become an obligation. A standard that, if not met, would be interpreted not as a single loss, but as evidence that the whole story was unraveling. Serena was no longer competing for joy. She was not competing for personal ambition in any clean or simple sense. She was competing because losing had ceased to be a normal athletic outcome and had become a cultural event with consequences that only she would be required to manage. Every match she entered was a negotiation between what her body and mind could actually sustain and what the world expected them to sustain without question. Victory, rather than freeing her, had narrowed the space around her until there was barely room to move. And the celebrations, the trophies raised, the applause received, the records announced, became almost mechanical over time. Because in her mind, before the current match was fully finished, the next tournament was already waiting with its own set of demands. She began to understand something deeply uncomfortable. Success was not a path to peace. Success was a path to permanent vigilance. And the price of that vigilance, paid in hours of lost sleep, in anxiety managed in private, in emotional energy spent managing a public image that bore increasingly little resemblance to her actual interior life, was compounding with every season. When Serena Williams finally decided to leave tennis, it did not arrive as a dramatic announcement or a carefully orchestrated farewell. It came quietly, built from years of signals her body and mind had been sending with increasing urgency, signals she had spent most of her life learning to override. Her body was no longer a reliable partner. It responded more slowly. Injuries lasted longer. Recovery demanded more time than her schedule could accommodate. Long training sessions left consequences that did not resolve themselves overnight. And her mind, for the first time in her adult life, had no remaining room for the particular kind of excitement that had once driven her onto practice courts at dawn. There was only a growing, honest awareness of everything she would have to absorb to continue, and a slowly forming recognition that absorbing it was no longer worth the cost. Leaving tennis was not surrender in the face of failure. Serena had not run out of ability. Even in her final season, she had enough to make opponents genuinely uncomfortable, enough to produce moments that reminded the sport exactly who it was watching. What she had run out of was the willingness to keep gambling her health, her family presence, and the fragile sense of something approaching peace against the demands of a role she had been living inside since she was old enough to hold a racket. Tennis was not just a career for Serena. It was the only language she had used to communicate with the world since childhood. Leaving it meant relinquishing an identity that had structured every day of her adult life. It meant facing a void with no short-term goals to fill it, no tournament schedule to organize her time, no familiar pressures to channel her energy into. And in that void, every question she had spent decades postponing would finally have nowhere left to hide. She chose the language of transition when she spoke about her decision. Not retirement in the way a door slams shut, but evolution, moving towards something else rather than simply stopping. This was not evasion. It was a woman who had spent 30 years performing strength for the world's benefit, finally allowing herself to step away from that performance in a way that did not require a triumphant final moment for validation. She did not need a championship send-off to confirm her place in history. What she had already done was enough. And the recognition that it was enough, that she did not owe the world one more proof, was one of the most honest things she had produced in an entire career built on extraordinary honesty with opponents who never quite managed to beat her. When Serena Williams left the court behind, the double life that had structured her existence for more than 2 decades slowly closed, and the silence that replaced it was not comfortable. It was not the well-earned rest of a champion relaxing into retirement. It was the unfamiliar and sometimes disorienting experience of a person who had built every habit, every reflex, every sense of purpose around a framework that no longer existed. She woke up on mornings without a schedule to fill. Her body still carried the accumulated memory of pain. Her mind still defaulted to a state of alertness that had no current purpose to attach itself to. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a person who has been running at full speed for 30 years and suddenly finds no road ahead, and has to figure out what standing still actually feels like. Questions surfaced that had never been given time before. Who was she when she was not defined by victories? What did she value when nothing external was demanding a performance from her? What did she actually feel when she was not managing what the world could see of her feelings? These questions did not arrive with answers attached. They arrived as open space, vast and unfamiliar, with no scoreboard to confirm she was navigating it correctly. The physical pain remained. The years of impact on her body did not resolve because competition had stopped. The mental vigilance did not immediately relax. Serena had spent decades training herself into a specific way of existing, alert, controlled, defended, and that training did not simply switch off because the circumstances that had required it were gone. What she found in that silence was not peace exactly. It was the beginning of the long work of learning to exist without armor, of allowing herself to be tired without immediately converting the tiredness into fuel for the next session, of sitting with uncertainty without immediately locating a target to focus her energy toward, of being human in the most fundamental and unglamorous sense, present with what remains when everything extraordinary has been set down. Serena had always been called invincible. What the silence taught her was something the court never could, that invincibility is not a human quality. It is a projection, a story a person tells, or a story a world tells about a person, to make sense of what they are witnessing. The real Serena, the one who existed behind the projection, had always been breakable, always been exhausted, always been afraid. She had simply been extraordinarily disciplined about making sure the world never had to know it. In the silence, that discipline was no longer required, and learning to live without it was harder than any match she had ever played. When the full arc of Serena Williams' life is laid out without the trophies placed at the front of the story, what becomes visible is not primarily a story about greatness. It is a story about endurance, about the specific, sustained, largely unacknowledged endurance of a person who was never once given the option of being ordinary. She grew up in an environment that did not offer safety. She was raised in a family system that conditioned her to see vulnerability as a threat. She entered a sport that celebrated her achievements while punishing her humanity. She survived 2 near-death experiences and returned, each time, to a world that used her resilience as evidence that she was fine, that she did not need anything different, that the system had worked. The world was wrong. Serena Williams was not invincible. She was a human being with extraordinary discipline and extraordinary cost. She paid for every trophy, not just in the hours of practice that filled stadiums and generated headlines, but in the sleep she did not get, the fears she did not express, the vulnerability she was never permitted to show, the medical dismissal that nearly killed her, the guilt she carried as a mother trying to exist in two places at once, and the decades-long performance of strength that left almost no room for the actual person beneath it to breathe. The lesson here is not about tennis. It is about what we demand of the people we celebrate. Society glorifies strength, but society rarely asks what the production of that strength actually required from the person displaying it. Rarely asks what was lost in the process of becoming the symbol everyone else needed. Rarely grants the people carrying the heaviest weight the simple, basic dignity of being seen as fully human, with limits, with fears, with an entirely legitimate need to stop. Serena Williams endured on behalf of more than herself. She endured on behalf of every black woman athlete who came after her, on behalf of everyone who watched and recognized something of their own experience in the way she was treated, on behalf of a generation that needed proof that the barriers could be pushed even if they could never be fully eliminated. She carried that weight without being asked whether she wanted to, without being compensated for it in any way that matched what it cost. When she finally stopped, it was not a failure. It was an act of honesty so rare in the world of elite sports that most people did not know what to do with it. She stopped because the human body has limits. She stopped because some battles should not be made to last indefinitely. She stopped because she had given enough, more than enough, and she finally allowed herself to know it. Serena Williams does not need another trophy to confirm her place in the record of what is possible. What she built across 30 years on a court, and everything she endured to build it, is already permanent. No revision required. No further proof necessary. The most honest thing we can offer her now is not applause. It is acknowledgement of the full cost, of the full weight, of the full human being who carried it all, much longer than anyone had the right to ask. She deserved better from the world that celebrated her. And knowing that, sitting with that uncomfortable truth instead of smoothing it over with highlight reels and trophy counts, is the only way her story becomes something more than entertainment. It becomes a mirror, and that mirror asks a question worth answering. What do we owe the people we make into symbols?